Okay guys, welcome back to Ask a Former Atheist with Dr. Rich Suplita. And so during this month of June, what I'm wanting to do is continue to look at issues related to LGBTQ and hopefully provide some clarity, some information, some insight into what's going on with these narratives as they're being promulgated out and even in many instances coerced and forced upon society. And so today I want to look at the issue of intersex conditions. Really the question I want to provide a satisfactory answer for today is the question of, do intersex conditions disprove a gender or a sex binary? Okay, so what are intersex conditions, and do they affect the idea that something like biological sex is binary, either male or female? And what about this issue of the so-called gender non-binary? And so we'll get into some of these issues today. It's going to be a little bit longer of a video. I'm going to wear more of my neuroscientist hat here. As many of you know, for over a decade, I was a neuroscience professor at the University of Georgia. I actually led another group, not UGA Atheists, but a group I founded there called Neuroscience for Kids. And so I've been a neuroscience educator at the collegiate level all the way down to taking neuroscience facts into elementary schools, even here in Athens, for a longer period of time than I've been an evangelist and Christian apologist. Okay, so do intersex conditions disprove a gender or a sex binary? Spoiler alert! The answer is no, not at all. They do not disprove a sex binary. But there's quite a bit to unpack here, scientifically speaking, so let's go ahead and get to work on that. So I want to approach this by looking at two false claims. One of the false claims is on our side, okay? The other is on their side. And by our side versus their side, with our side, I mean those of us who maintain that there are two and only two human sexes, male and female, and that this is an attribute of individual human persons that's detectable long before birth, and that it is a biologically fixed attribute across a person's lifespan. Okay, so false claim number one. Remember, this one is commonly claimed by folks on our side of this worldview issue. Here it is. Everybody is born either XX, that is genetically female, or XY, that is genetically male, and everyone's sex is always determined by his or her genes. So that statement turns out to be false, although it certainly is the normal or the usual case, okay? It's false if you try to apply it across the board, but in general, that is in fact the way it works. It is an accurate statement of well over 99% of humans. In other words, fewer than 1% of humans have clinically identifiable sexual or reproductive variations. In terms of babies born with ambiguous genitalia, the prevalence is about 1 in 300,000 live births. I just read another article that would put it actually lower than that. 1 in 300,000 corresponds to 0.03%. I just saw another scientific article, peer-reviewed, that said 0.017 would be a more accurate estimate of true intersex conditions. But there are rare exceptions to the general rule, okay? And if you think about it, this is in no way surprising. You shouldn't be surprised by this. And as I'll argue in just a moment, these rare exceptions that are represented by intersex conditions actually serve to prove the rule, okay? They don't disrupt the rule. In fact, they serve to prove the rule. namely that there is a sexual binary in humans. Okay, so what's the deal with these exceptions? We could talk about this for a long time, but for the sake of time, I'm going to avoid detailing each specific exception. For our purposes here, that's unnecessary, but if you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to do that. It's a fascinating topic, in my opinion. You can simply research intersex conditions. So just Google or use a better browser like DuckDuckGo that's not so devoted to covering up certain narratives. And research intersex conditions, and you can read until your heart is content. So what these intersex conditions have in common is that they are all what we call congenital abnormalities, meaning that they're present at birth. So this will be of tremendous significance later as we consider the enormously trendy social construct of transgenderism, okay, so-called transgenderism, because these are not at all the same sort of thing. And that's really the main point. There's several points I want to get at here, but the main point is that transgenderism is not at all the same type of thing. It's in fact quite opposite, and we'll get to that later, as what is represented by intersex conditions. So when we say congenital abnormality, we're not saying, let's just say what we're not saying, okay? We're not saying that babies born with congenital conditions are somehow defective. We want to be clear about that. These are not lesser people. They're not inferior people. Okay? These are beautiful human persons created equally in God's image in the same way that those of us who are normal are, right? And they are worthy of the dignity, the moral value, and the human rights to which every single human is fully entitled. But the term abnormality, when we look at that term, if you think about it, that's just a statistical term. In other words, what is abnormal is that which is a relatively rare presentation. By definition, that's what it means to be abnormal. It's the exception rather than the rule or the norm. That's all. Nothing more, nothing less. Okay, in case you haven't realized it yet, we don't live in a perfect world. That's why there are abnormal physiological, biological, genetic conditions. We don't live in a perfect world, far from it. Even our own bodies are far from perfect. We sometimes get injured. We sometimes get sick. As amazing as our recuperative processes are, sometimes those injuries and illnesses don't go away. Sometimes people get sick and die. And if you stick around long enough, I can assure you, okay, I know this based upon personal experience, by the time you're age 50, you're going to start developing aches and pains and cricks and creaks and body parts that you didn't even realize you had. And I'm told that it doesn't get any better from here on out. Okay? So this is precisely the way that the Bible, God's Word, describes the state of the world, the state of nature itself. Things are not in the perfect and harmonious state in which God created them. Paul says in Romans chapter 8, and also I believe 1 Corinthians 15 deals with a similar concept, that the natural order itself, nature itself, the physical constituents and processes of the cosmos that you and I presently inhabit has been, in his words, subjected to futility by God. This is part of the curse of the fall. It's been subjected to futility, awaiting deliverance of the new creation that God has promised in Christ. And in fact, God has demonstrated through the resurrection of Jesus Christ his intention to keep that promise. So there is good news at the end of all of this. But in other words, right now, you and I live as fallen creatures, and we live in a fallen world. A world in which the effects of sin, both direct and indirect, affect everything about the world around us and also the very physics of our own bodies. Consequently, the development of the human body doesn't always follow the course that God designed in the beginning. Okay? To illustrate, the most common congenital abnormalities are heart irregularities. After that comes things like neural tube abnormalities leading to conditions like spina bifida, anencephaly. There are genetic conditions like trisomy 21, more commonly known as Down syndrome. And this results when 3 chromosomes are present in what is typically the 21st chromosomal pair. Okay, so you have 3 chromosomes there instead of 2, and that leads to developmental differences. Other examples include congenital abnormalities like babies being born with 6 or more digits on each hand or foot. This is known as polydactylism. Babies born without fusion of the roof of the mouth. You're familiar with this. It's known as cleft palate. Okay. Sometimes a developing baby's genetic makeup, or what we call the genotype, okay, the person's genetic makeup or genotype differs from his or her bodily appearance, or what we call phenotype. So genotype, that's the genes. Phenotype, that is the manifestation or the bodily appearance, okay? So this can be due to genetic abnormalities or from the influences of things called teratogens. These are harmful substances from outside of the body, things like chemicals, alcohol, exposure to radiation, and so forth. And sometimes it's both, and these can affect how that human person develops. So when it comes to the sex chromosomes, that is the 23rd pair of chromosomes in humans, there can be a lack of congruence, there can be an incongruence between genotype and phenotype, between genes and then physical presentation or physical appearance. Most often, these abnormalities are very subtle, and the baby clearly tends towards either male or female in presentation. That even when there's an intersex condition, that's the overwhelming majority of those are clearly one or the other, okay? Relatively few are truly ambiguous, but it does happen. Occasionally, a baby born with what appears to be distinctly female external genitalia is a genotypic male, or even vice versa. In certain conditions like AIS, that stands for androgen insensitivity syndrome, the androgens are the, quote, male hormones, testosterone, dihydrotestosterone. The individual will naturally undergo the male pattern of puberty, will naturally not undergo, I misread that. That person will naturally fail to undergo, they won't undergo the male pattern of puberty, and they will present and live as a biological female, which that person is a biological female, okay? In other conditions, in terms of the body type, the body plan, the plan that's laid out, that has constructed that female's body, the person with AIS, that is a human female. In other conditions like a condition called guevedoses, it's a Spanish word. Guevedoses is a condition that is very common in the Dominican Republic. A baby is born without male external genitalia, but will later undergo male puberty because his gonads are undescended testicles. They're testes that are still retained within the cavity of the body, okay? So in Spanish, I'm not trying to be gratuitous here, this is just what the term means, but guevedoses in Spanish literally means balls at 12, okay? And this is descriptive of exactly what happens. With the signals from the hypothalamus, the brain, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland that start the process of secondary sexual development, also known as puberty, and that usually occurs around age 12. it becomes clear that that particular child is in fact a male. And the testicles will descend and they'll grow a penis and so on and so forth. So it's not true that a person's genes and bodily attributes always match. That's the point here. Those of us who recognize the natural sexual dichotomy of human beings need to stop repeating that particular piece of misinformation. So now let's look at the other side, okay? What about a popular false statement from the other side of this particular narrative? There are different ways this can be phrased, but I think the best way to state the misinformation that's being propagated from the other side of this issue is something like this. In humans, sex is non-binary. In other words, it is not true, according to this narrative, it is not true that there are only two sexes, male and female. There are other possibilities that are naturally occurring. So that's the claim. What's the truth about this? Well, no, that's not true. That's a false statement. In a nutshell, I should say no pun intended, okay? In a nutshell, here's why. Most people probably don't realize that biologically and physiologically, now stick with me here, biologically and physiologically, sex is not defined chromosomally. It's not defined by a person's chromosomal endowment. It's not defined XX, XY, XXY, XYY, whatever particular permutations of that we may encounter. Nor is it defined based upon genitalia, things like penises and vaginas, and so forth. Now, typically there is obviously a strong correspondence here, but that's not how these things are defined. If you look at birds, for example, birds don't have penises and vaginas. They have something called a cloaca, and it looks the same externally in both the male and the female. And the way they reproduce is by rubbing those apparatuses, those physiological features together, and that's where sperm and egg, sperm will be deposited, right? So we don't base male and female upon external genitalia or even strictly speaking on chromosomes. Technically, it's not even defined by the presence of ovaries or testicles, but you're getting very, very close there, and here's why. Biologically, sex is determined by whether the organism produces gametes, sex cells, that are fewer and larger, okay? And we call those ova. We call those egg cells or ova, okay? Or whether the organism produces many more smaller gametes called sperm. Obviously, females, ova, eggs, males, sperm, okay? Now here's what normally happens in humans during primary sexual development, not puberty, okay? We're not talking about 11, 12, 13 years of age. We're rewinding all the way back to early gestation, the early in utero period, when that child is just beginning to develop in his or her mother's uterus, okay? So this process kicks off around 6 weeks after fertilization, very early. Normal gestation is 40 weeks. This is around 6 weeks. So about 6 weeks after fertilization, up until that point, the gonads, what will either become ovaries in females or testicles in males, okay, are undifferentiated. They're within the cavity of the body. It's the same type of tissue in the same place. It looks the same. It is composed of the same biological constituents. They're undifferentiated, okay, up until 6 weeks. But at that point, and never later than that, these genetic males and genetic females have the potential to, these gonads have the potential to become either ovaries or testes or testicles, depending on which signals they receive, okay? So in humans who are chromosomally XY at the 23rd pair of chromosomes, a tiny region of that Y chromosome called SRY, and that stands for the sex-determining region of the Y chromosome, becomes active, okay, and it sends signals that are going to turn those undifferentiated gonads into testes, into testicles. Okay, they follow the male pattern of development. And as the testes develop, they begin to release a hormone that you've all heard of before. It's called, yep, you guessed it, testosterone, okay? It's called testosterone because the primary source of testosterone is the testes. In normal male development, the brain is defeminized. Kind of a strange word. We don't say that the brain is feminized, okay? The feminine pattern of development sort of proceeds, shall we say, and this is not real precise, I mean, you could go a mile deep with this stuff, but tends to proceed essentially by default, okay? Something different's going to happen to defeminize the male brain so that the male brain departs from the trajectory of female development and becomes a uniquely male brain. So the brain is defeminized early in development, leading to structural changes and later to functional changes in the male brain, meaning, among other things, that the brain's hypothalamus, it's a very, very deep structure of the brain, which is going to be the control station for the pituitary gland, the master gland of the hormonal system, will never be able to support processes like ovulation, menstruation, and gestation. So even from very, very early on in the in utero gestational period, the male brain is being defeminized, and it's never going to be able to, no matter what you do later, support those types of processes. In the hypothalamus, a fundamentally different structure and function is established even through puberty, and is still more, even though puberty is still more than a decade away, that male's brain, that developing male's brain is already established, set up, the cells are different, the structure is different than what is found in the female brain. Very important to note here, this cannot be reversed, even if cross-sex hormones are administered right at birth and after birth, even late in the gestational period. If they're introduced to the mother, you're not going to be able to change the way the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are structured and how they will later function at puberty and therefore the next few decades of life. Okay? The testes of the developing male also produces a substance called AMH, that stands for anti-Mullerian hormone, which prevents structures like fallopian tubes and a uterus from developing. Again, all of these processes are active very early in gestation, during early in utero child development. They are sensitive to what we call critical windows. They cannot be reversed at a later point in time period. That's just biological and physiological reality, okay? So hypothetically, surgeons could implant ovaries and a uterus into a person born male at a later point in time and even administer physiological doses of female hormones according to the natural ovulatory cycle of women, but that person's body will never support ovulation because the organization of the hypothalamus in the brain was never set up that way in the first place and cannot be altered. Okay, now zooming back out to our big picture issue here. Here's what we have. It is scientifically true that there are two and only two biological sexes in humans. Following the male pattern of development, which begins around 6 weeks gestationally, a cascade of genetic, biochemical, and structural events are initiated that typically results in a body that will produce and release sperm cells beginning some 12 years later in most males, okay? Following the female pattern of development, the undifferentiated gonads become ovaries, and the hypothalamus is not defeminized. The Mullerian structures, including the fallopian tubes, uterus, etc., develop, and around 10 or 12 years later, they begin receiving signals from the brain's hypothalamus through the pituitary gland, and this will initiate and regulate what we call the cycle known as menses, or sometimes called the menstrual cycle, right? That is, ova, egg cells, are matured and they're released, usually, not always, but usually one per month, every month, from the time of menarche, the onset of the menses cycle, until menopause, the last cycle, or across about half of the typical woman's lifespan. The only gametes that ovaries can produce are ova, quote-unquote eggs, and the only gametes that testicles can produce are sperm. That's the female gamete, and there's the female gamete, and then there is the male gamete. There is no third gamete, okay? So is sex binary in humans? Yes. You have ova, you have sperm. If we're going to have reproduction, then we need to unite sperm and ova. There's no third option. There's no third gamete. There's no intermediate gamete. Those are what we've got. Thus, there are two and only two biological sexes in human beings. So there are two related topics here that we need to deal with in today's video real quick as we wrap this up. So first, let's consider the idea of sex versus gender. Sex versus gender. We'll look at the phenomenon after that of transgenderism. So first, let's consider the idea of sex and gender. Very often, the subject of biological sex and something called gender are conflated. I've noticed that people on all sides of this conversation and issue do this, and I'm sure that I have done this and still sometimes conflate those, not being very precise with my words and phrases. And you know, it's hard to avoid doing that every time this subject comes up and with every application. But I've found that there is an easy way to keep this straight, okay? A very simple way to keep this straight. And here it is, and I'm not mocking anyone. It might sound like I'm oversimplifying to the point of ridicule. That's not my intention. I'm just being real. And here's how you can keep it straight. Biological sex is real. It's reality. It's literal, it's objective, and it's a physical fact. Gender, on the other hand, is what is called a social construct. Now, even the progressive leftists, they'll admit this. Oh yeah, gender is a social construct. In fact, they're the big proponents of what we call social constructivism, which is sort of a postmodern philosophical idea. So as a social construct, they'll say, it merely reflects an idea that has gained traction in a particular culture or society. In other words, social constructs are not objective realities. Therefore, when someone says to me, well, Rich, don't you know gender is non-binary? I'm gender fluid, or gender is a continuum. I merely point out to them that they are literally playing a game of make-believe. Again, I'm not trying to insult that person. It's not my intention. I communicate this with respect. But if a construct like gender is going to be divorced from biological reality, and that's what they've done, then as a person of science, as a scientist, okay, and as a good critical thinker, I should feel under no obligation to play along with that. it's a free country. A person can, if they want, identify as non-binary, as bigendered, as null-gendered, as gender fluid, as lighter fluid, as a cactus, for all I care. I do care about their sanity, but if they're insistent upon following ridiculous, non-scientific, subjective narratives, then that's their right to do that. But that person has entered the realm of intrapersonal, inside their own person, intrapersonal subjectivity. They can pretend to be whatever they want with whoever else wants to play make-believe with them. But here's what I would say, just be sure to leave me out of it. I don't want to participate in that. And that should fully be my right, to stick with biological, physiological, scientific reality and truth. When their great space coaster re-enters the orbit of the physical reality that the rest of us inhabit and are prepared to discuss reality on reality's terms, then I'd be delighted to re-engage them in conversation. So, short summary here. Sex and gender, as it has been redefined, are two different things. Sex is biological reality. Gender is just a social construct that any person is free to reject as the subjective balderdash gobbledygook that it is, and refuse to play make-believe. And that brings us to transgenderism, or the disorder of the psyche or the mind, formerly known as gender identity disorder. And yes, I know, technically it's possible for a person to have, quote, gender dysphoria and not be transgender. Before one of our leftist friends points that out, I'll go ahead and make that minor concession, okay? Regardless, we're still talking about a mental/spiritual condition which begins with the powerful and persistent delusion that one is in the wrong body. By definition, that's where all of this supposedly begins. And by no means am I denying the reality that there are people who truly feel like they're in the wrong sex's body, okay? Delusions happen. Those are true psychological phenomenon, and we should take them seriously without deriding the person. So I'll address transgenderism more thoroughly from a psychological, neuroscientific, and spiritual perspective in a subsequent video. But suffice it to say here that intersex conditions and so-called transgenderism have nothing to do with each other. I'll say it again. Intersex conditions, things like androgen insensitivity syndrome, things like congenital adrenal hyperplasia, Klinefelter syndrome, whatever one you want to throw out, intersex conditions and so-called transgenderism have nothing to do with each other. As it stands, less than 1% of the population is affected by intersex conditions. Those bent on promoting the LGBTQ2SIA+ narrative and pushing it into literally everything and normalizing abnormal psychology, well, those folks love to appeal to intersex conditions as if those provide them some sort of scientific traction or leverage. They do not. Intersex conditions do not provide that type of leverage. They just don't. Think about it. So it turns out to be about 0.017 to 0.03% of births are true intersex conditions, true ambiguity. But think about it. It wouldn't matter if that were 1% or 10% of the population. It wouldn't matter logically if 90% of the population was born intersex. It has nothing whatsoever to do with so-called transgenderism. So the point is entirely moot. Why is that? Well, because transgenderism is defined as a disconnect or an incongruence between a person's gender identity and his or her biological sex. Every case of transgender surgery, so-called gender-affirming surgery, with which I'm familiar, involves a person who was born male, getting unambiguously male, okay, getting body parts removed and taking hormones in an effort to become something that his body simply is not, or with the reverse scenario being inflicted on a female's body. So biologically, guys, this is not just an apples to oranges comparison. It's apples to Ferraris. It's oranges to rhinoceroses. It's not even close to the same thing. Intersex conditions are congenital physiological abnormalities. They are biological developments that are rooted in objective physiological reality. On the other hand, so-called transgenderism is pretty much the opposite. It involves entirely subjective psychogenic experiences that involve a contradiction of objective physiological reality. So I realize this has been a rather lengthy treatment of this topic, but it's an important one. It's even important for non-scientists, non-clergy, Christian laypersons to be prepared to answer the challenge of intersex conditions vis-a-vis transgenderism, given the skyrocketing ascendancy of the LGBTQ narratives and the increasing coercion involved in propagating those narratives. Now, my prayer is that this content is helpful to you. For more free resources on Christian apologetics, defending the capital T truth of traditional biblical Christianity, be sure to visit our website at www.askaformeratheist.com. I'm Dr. Rich Suplita, and for both of us here at Ask a Former Atheist, me and my dear wife, have a great day, God bless you, and see you again soon.